Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Changing the Climate, a show where we talk about the changing world around us and how we can make it better. Brought to you by Climate Change Realty. The only real estate brokerage that donates 50% of its net commissions to 501c3 nonprofit organizations dedicated to fighting climate change. Andrew, pleasure to have you on the show, man. Let's talk about finance and policy, all the boring things that are actually the most essential parts of getting action done.
All right. Well, us policy geeks, Ethan, find this stuff exciting. So I don't know about your listeners, but we'll see. I'll give it a whirl.
Yeah,
Great
man.
to be here.
I'm excited. So hopefully the energy will emote through the screen or through the people's ears. But we always like to get the podcast started with background on who you are and how you got to be doing what you're doing.
Sure. So I'm an East Coaster, born in DC, grew up in Providence, Rhode Island. My academic interests when I was in college focused around Russian studies and the former Soviet Union, and spending a lot of time focused on that part of the world, learning the language, learning the history, the culture, and studying there kind of propelled me into the work world in former Soviet Central Asia. And so I started my career in the international development space, working for a foundation in Kazakhstan. And the formative years of my mid-20s were spent living abroad, working on projects of various kinds in Central Asia, which is probably not a typical mid-20s experience, but it had a few facets to it that I think have really propelled me to where I am today. In particular, I got to experience up close what all the barriers were to making change in society, and how you try to overcome those barriers through various different mechanisms like finance and policy and building capacity and partnerships and stuff like that. On the one hand, kind of learning how the world works. And I also got a front row seat to issues related to pollution from development, economic development that was happening really fast, but in not very clean and environmentally sustainable way. And that got me interested in the sustainability issues and climate change that has been the focus of my career since I came back to the US, which was for grad school in 2007. So I did a couple of years of master's study to learn about all those things that I had interested me, but I didn't know anything about, like economics and policy and climate change. And I've been at those ever since in some fashion or another. Moved to DC, worked for the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector investing arm of the World Bank Group. I spent 4 years at the US Department of State working on their climate change team. That's the same team that does the negotiations, including those that are going on in Glasgow right now. But I worked primarily on foreign assistance programs and on diplomatic initiatives, which were a couple other main pillars of the work of that office. And that itself is a whole experience unto itself, which we could talk about. But after doing that for 4 years, my wife and I moved to New York in 2014, hung out a shingle, started doing project work as an independent consultant. And one thing has led to another. I spent 4 years independent, but began doing a lot of work for a very exciting startup called Climate Finance Advisors, founded by Stacy Swan, that works on all those same issues, but really through the lens of financial markets and trying to drive finance to climate solutions, both low emission solutions and climate resilient solutions, and also helping businesses and investors get climate smart with their investment decision making. So I, since 2018, have joined Climate Finance Advisors full time. I rolled my practice into CFA, and here I am 3.5 years later.
And we're happy to have you, man, doing some good work. What did you say you were doing before you were an independent consultant?
Um, so I was at the Department of State
Okay.
in Washington, working essentially as a diplomat, but also overseeing foreign assistance programs. So taxpayer dollars that go towards helping developing countries address their challenges. In this
Okay.
case, the transition to clean energy, to low carbon economy, and sustainable development.
All right. Well, you might not agree, but you seem to me like a guy who understands how the world works, which is obviously very interesting to me. I am curious, going through that whole story, how your perspective. What state did you say you're from? You're from the East Coast. Are you from like Maryland or
I'm from Rhode Island. Well, born
Rhode
in
Island?
DC, but yeah, I'm a Rhode Islander.
Yeah, so we have this American way of life ingrained into us from the time we're in kindergarten all the way through K through 12, and then we go out and we explore and do different things. But you left the country, so I'm really interested how your perspective has changed when you were seeing how all these different other Eastern, I guess, kind of the in between East and West countries worked. What did that made you realize about the way societies function?
Yeah, that's a deep question.
I love those.
I mean, I think obviously there are a lot of cultural differences, but I felt like going to that region, I had a leg up because I already spoke the language. I had already studied Russian and lived
Russian.
in Russia for a number of years. So that and the familiarity with the culture, which is not the same as Russia, but similar.
Wait, you lived in Russia as well before that?
As a yeah, as a student before
Okay.
that in a fellowship. I kind of gave you the real Cliff Notes version. So there are other nooks and crannies in there.
Man's been around the
Um,
world.
yeah. Um, so anyway, to get to your question, I felt like in some respects, I kind of had the key to unlocking the culture to that society, right? And that you can kind of look at your experience visiting a place as half full or half empty. Like either you kind of you got in and you were able to connect, or it was just like too foreign and you didn't really have a way in. I felt like I had a way in. So I felt like we have a lot more in common than we have differences, right?
Of
And
course.
so that I think was one of the takeaways, is sort of the unifying facets of like the human experience, right? So I mean, obviously we're different, and some societies I think are even more different from those that I was in, and American culture. But I thought it was amazing, and that I wanted to do international development worldwide and tackle climate change worldwide, because these are really global challenges. I mean, every place is different, but there's a remarkable continuity in a number of these global challenges from region to region and country to country.
Why tackle climate change? Why help people worldwide? Why not understand how the world works and then just make a bunch of money and buy a yacht?
No, I mean, maybe a yacht would be nice too, but I guess my answer to that is I'm someone who's always had the good fortune to really be captivated by the things that I've either been studying or working on, right?
Uh-huh.
Like I was that dork who really liked school, and so for from a young age, I've always felt like whatever I'm doing should really motivate me and
Yeah,
fuel me,
yes.
right? And I'm also someone who can sometimes have a short attention span for things I'm not interested in.
I hear
So I
that.
guess that means, like, if I don't really love it, I can't fake it for that long, right? And just doing something to make money isn't that interesting. And we're fortunate in this country that there's such a diversity of career options out there that many of us don't have to work jobs that we positively hate to make ends meet. Some of us do, and there is a lot of inequity in society. But we have a very vibrant and diverse economy, and so many of us have some choice there. And so I've just always kind of followed my nose and done things that I've had some passion about. And I mean, I guess it's kind of a cliche, right? Like, do what you love. I think for young people, you often don't really know what you love until you try it. But the corollary of doing what you love is try things that interest you, and then you figure out what you love, and then you stick with it, or you pivot to something else, right?
Yep.
And so, like, I mean, maybe if I had, tried investment banking at 22 and loved it, maybe I would be sailing on some yacht right now, right? But I was into Russian studies when I was 22, and so
Right.
I bought a ticket and hopped over to Moscow, and the rest is history. So there
Yeah.
you have it.
No, I appreciate you sharing all that stuff, man. It really helps me get the perspective. Yeah, so I guess I kind of just want to dive in on barriers to change, because that's something I'm very interested in. Because things are always changing, the society is continually moving. Nothing is really in a state of stagnation. It's either moving forwards, backwards. In my mind, I guess that's kind of a false dichotomy as well. But throughout your experiences, what have you learned are the biggest barriers to change, and how do people overcome them when it comes to serious issues like environmental action or social justice or any of that stuff?
Yeah. I don't know if there's any single answer to that. And I think it kind of depends on what scale you're talking about, at the level of the individual, the community, a society. But a couple thoughts on that. I think that we humans psychologically feel loss aversion very strongly, right? That was actually something I learned in grad school. It was incredibly valuable about behavioral psychology and behavioral economics. It hurts a lot more to lose a $5 bill than it does to then it feels good to find a $5 bill on the sidewalk. That might be intuitive, it might not be, but there's a lot of very robust evidence that that's how human psychology works. So what that means is that unless you've got a lot more people who are gaining than the people who are losing, or the gains need to way outweigh the losses, you're going to have people who don't want to do things that change society, right? Because they're typically winners and losers when things change. And that's kind of the nature of the beast. And I found from my time, in government and working on policy, change is really hard. I mean, sometimes change kind of happens by itself with technology diffusion, right? Like, no one was against cell phones, right? So, or iPads, so they took over the world.
Mm-hmm.
But most change, I would say, doesn't happen that way, or at least not at first and not by itself. And so it's really about understanding the kind of pathway to change, the links in the causal chain, and how do you remove those barriers. And that's, I think, a lot of what international development is about, is everyone sees, these are, and international development isn't only about developing countries. It primarily is, I think, for many of us, but really it's about transforming all societies. And it's not hard to see how we're beset by a lot of social and environmental problems. It can be very hard to figure out how you get from point A to point B to solve those problems, right? And there are typically a lot of barriers that interact in complex ways. And the name of the game is, how do you overcome those barriers?
Right. So how do you overcome those barriers? What did you learn in your time before you joined Climate Finance Advisors when you were working independently?
Well, those are a couple different questions, right? I guess, I mean, was it my own personal barrier of trying to make a living as an independent consultant, or solving the world's problems, right?
Well, I mean, I feel like everything is kind of pretty similar, like
Mhm.
macro level, micro level. The changes that work for you might work for the rest of the world. I don't know. Depends.
Uh, so, well, let me try to figure out how to unpack that one. I think um, partnerships are important. Um, Figuring out how you collaborate with different people and different entities, that's something that I think spans the micro and the macro. It's the partnerships is the 17th of the 17 sustainable development goals.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not one you hear that much about because it seems kind of airy fairy and, what are partnerships anyway? But it means something to me. And I think, having worked a lot in the nonprofit sector, having worked in government, having worked in diplomacy, I mean, you build buy-in, you build consensus, you build support for things through partnership. You cobble together the different resources you need. You expand your scope so that you can touch more people.
And partnership in what sense? Is it the same as just collaboration, meaning just someone beyond yourself, or like specifically just you and one other person or you and one other group working together at the same goal?
The former, I mean, I meant it in sort of the broadest sense possible of collaborating
Yeah.
with multiple other entities, often many other entities, to achieve the scope and scale that you need to solve your problem, and to also overcome for your own shortcomings or lack of resources, right? I mean, it's sort of the basic principles of Adam Smith, right? And the Wealth of Nations is, why does trade happen? Because someone else has some good or service that you need and you don't have, and you have something that they need and don't have, right? So you trade, right? And that's like a sort of a cartoon simplified version of like what partnerships are about.
Totally. Why do you suppose there's so many nonprofits that are essentially working on the same thing? And that's not to say that they don't work together and collaborate, but why do you suppose there's so many separate ones?
It's a good question. I think nonprofits try to do different things, right? Some of them are trying to solve local problems. And to the extent that there are lots of different localities, you've lots of you've got a need in every town and village, right, to solve that problem. There are a lot of nonprofits trying to solve the bigger problems too, but I don't know if I'd say that the space is overcrowded, right? I mean, there are more of them than of government because uh, government has a monopoly in a given geographic area or thematic area, right? Like at the federal level, there's only one Department of Energy, right? Or in a city, there's only one mayor. Although I don't know, maybe I should take that back. In the federal government, there's lots of overlapping jurisdictions. You need to also, you can have turf battles there too, even when in theory there is only one person responsible for one thing. So it's just it's organic, right? And you've got different groups popping up, and so long as these social problems and challenges exist that need to be solved, it means that we're not devoting enough resources to them. So it might seem like we got a lot of nonprofits, but we probably need a lot more, or they need to scale up a lot. It's either that or they're being inefficient. Some nonprofits are inefficient, but I actually think the nonprofit sector is often pretty efficient because they need to usually be pretty transparent to bring in resources from donors to continue to operate. And you need to be effective, right? Which is sometimes a higher bar than entities in other sectors like government or the private sector face, right? You might have a completely obsolete business model that can bring in dollars for the moment, but is kind of a bridge to nowhere for the future, right? And government, sometimes it works really well, but sometimes it doesn't work so well. So I don't know. I sense that your question was like a little bit express some skepticism towards the nonprofit sector. So I felt like I had to kind of step in and defend it a little bit.
No, well, good on you, man. I mean, obviously, people know I give most of my money to the nonprofit sector, but the truth behind my personal view and what and we'll get into climate finance advisors right after this is I would love to see a world where the economic machine is so effective that we don't need nonprofits, we don't need charitable giving. The systems they tax the untaxed externalities of environmental destruction or social inequity, not necessarily inequity, but pure just bad things like aren't happening because products and services are there to rectify those issues. That's what I would love to see. And I'm gonna keep reaching for utopian dreams because it gives me a never-ending challenge, and I love that. But Andrew, let's go into what is climate finance advisors.
Yeah, so I gave a little brief hint of it in my background, but I can expand. So Climate Finance Advisors, or CFA, is a boutique advisory firm that was founded in 2015 by Stacy Swan, and it works at the intersection of climate policy and financial markets. And as I was saying, it attempts to solve two problems. It tries to redirect financial resources, that exist in our economy to low carbon and climate resilient solutions. And it tries to get decision makers who are managing financial resources to make climate smart decisions, and do that by managing climate risks and by pursuing strategic climate opportunities. Right now, this is changing, but most financial decisions, you could argue, are climate blind, right? People are just not thinking about where climate fits in when they make a business decision or when they make an investment decision. And if we're going to solve climate change and not be completely sideswiped by the impacts of climate change, we have to change. We have to be thinking about these issues very actively. And it's a heavy lift because it's a complicated issue and it affects everyone in every sector differently, but it's not an impossible task. And those are the things that we spend our time working.
All right. Well, let's start with talking about how do you redirect these financial resources. I spoke to a private investor last week who was a really, really nice guy, but he's micro. How do you get I imagine you're trying to work with large financial institutions. We've also got the Clean Energy Credit Union coming on in a couple of weeks talking about this. Is something I'm very interested in. I was always really interested in finance. I think it has such a huge shadow over the whole way the whole world works. So how does this effectively work? What kind of arguments do you make, or what's the process behind this?
So it's interesting in that we don't have sort of a single cookie cutter model for type of client we work with and
Sure.
what we do for them. So we work with investors, we work with philanthropies, we work with governments, we work with development banks. And so all of them are interested in redirecting capital or, catalyzing markets for climate solutions in different ways. And they all do different things, right? Some of them give grants, some of them work on policy, some of them make investments themselves, right? So the answer is a little bit different, depending on sort of where you're sitting in society and what you're trying to do. I would say, as you've probably sensed from me now, I'm kind of a macro thinker on a lot of things, and our firm, not on everything. We do a lot of project specific work as well, but sort of our DNA, our original focus, and the way that we think about a lot of problems is similarly macro. And what that means is a lot of the work that we do is with government institutions, philanthropies, and very ambitious private sector entities that are thinking not just, how does my firm make different decisions, but how do we change the dynamics of the entire market, so that everyone in that market starts making different decisions, right? That's kind of how policymakers tend to think. And that's when it gets back to that comment that I made before about barriers, right? Why are all of the actors in this financial market today not doing what they should be doing on climate smart investing, right? Why are the technologies and solutions out there that exist, right, not getting the investment they need?
It's got to be
And
incentives. It's got to be
so,
incentives, whether it's positive or negative.
So it's incentives is a huge part of it, right? There are some other pieces too, right? Sometimes even people with the best of incentives do not have the sources, the expertise, the enabling environment. It may be a collective action problem where you need to develop some kind of standard within an industry, or no one wants to go first doing something that hasn't been tried. So incentives is a huge piece, but there are a lot of different types of barriers. There are information barriers, there are capacity barriers, and so like these are the things that you bump up against as an international development professional and as a sort of policy wonk. And financial markets are no different, right? People like to think of them as, being a well-oiled machine and, being perfectly logical. And they do a lot of things well, but they're not perfect. And I think climate change is just a classic example of a way that financial markets have responded very slowly and inadequately to a very big challenge. And so there needs to be a lot of intervention, both from within and from without, to change the way they operate very quickly. And that's not easy. And it's not, and things are happening. There have been a lot of very exciting announcements in Glasgow, for example, the last couple of weeks on, over $100 trillion of assets under management have now been pledged to net zero, right? These like gargantuan sums of money. Different people feel differently about what those pledges actually mean, but that itself is a pretty significant development. So it shows that things are happening, right? Like things are happening quickly, but it still may not be quickly enough, and pledges are also not the same as action. So
Certainly.
So there is so much work to be done, and it needs to happen fast. And so that's what we're working on.
Yeah. Well, you say, I mean, things are always happening, man. That's kind of just the way this game of life works. Also, you say, which is probably true, that like nobody wants to go first, but leaders always go first. That's what they do. And the people that we remember from history are always leaders, innovators, people who are doing things that haven't been done before or haven't been done in the same way. And I personally feel like those people really push the, I don't want to call it the narrative or the story forward. And I don't know, there'll always be people doing that kind of stuff. And I think that now more than ever, I know we talked, I think you and I both think at a macro level, but there are so many micro leaders now. There's so many billions of people, and each, like, we're all doing things that haven't been done before and pushing this, like this show just shows that anyone can be a leader. Like everyone's an integral piece of this puzzle, and these works are this problem is so pressing, and I agree we need to get more done now. So I don't know. I appreciate what you're doing. I wanted to cover the topic that we had discussed before the episode, which is blended finance. Can you explain like what that is and how that works?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. That was sort of our original secret sauce at Climate Finance Advisors. Stacy, our founder, created and ran the blended finance unit at the International Finance Corporation. That's the part of the World Bank, does private investing. And so she's one of the foremost leaders in that space, and our whole senior team has a lot of experience with it. So what is blended finance? Blended finance is using public or philanthropic capital, either investment capital or grant capital, to risk or to improve the risk return profile of an investment to get it over the threshold that makes it commercially attractive. So the reason it's called blended is because if you're thinking about a pie, typically you need some slice of that pie, it might be small, it might be big, to be part of the investment capital in a venture or in a project that tweaks the attractiveness of that investment to the market in such a way that the capital will flow, right? So to try to give you a concrete example, right? Take like the early days of wind power, right? Or solar power. You know, those are fundamentally technologies that are, well, they're commercially viable now. They have always had commercial potential because they provide a good, right? They provide electricity, which is something that people pay for, right? So if you could find out a way to provide this good at a price that was attractive, then, and the sort of investment terms to create those projects were sufficiently attractive, then you'd have a commercially viable business model and a commercially attractive investment, right? In the early days, as with any emerging technology, they hadn't gotten down the learning curve. They didn't have economies of scale. It wasn't proven. And so it couldn't compete with other energy technologies in the marketplace. And yet everyone saw that we needed low carbon energy. So how do you get there? The way you get there is you provide a subsidy that closes the gap to commercial viability, right? Blended finance works where you have something that is potentially commercial and close to commercial, but not quite there, right? If it's something that, like, I don't have a good example offhand, but I don't know, like building sandcastles on the beach, right? Like your business model is building sandcastles on the beach, but the beach washes away every 12 hours, right? It might be awesome, but it's probably not going to be a commercial business model, at least unless there's something I'm missing. And so blended finance is not going to solve that problem, right? You need other tools to solve that problem. But there are a lot of problems where you have like emerging technologies with commercial potential, or something that might never be fully commercially viable, but it's close, right? And you were talking about internalizing externalities.
Yeah.
If you can find a way to bring in those externalities in a way that kind of creates a market subsidy, that reflects the value that society places on the benefits that something provides, then you can use blended finance to solve it, right? And it will make something, it will make an investment look more attractive, right? And so you can, and sometimes it's just as simple as the price in the market. Sometimes there are specific gaps in the finance life cycle, right? Or the project life cycle, right? So a technology, when it's young, starts with sort of seed capital, right? Then it goes to venture, then it goes to private equity, then it goes to public markets, right? And then you have debt. And so like there are all these different segments of the market and stages. And when you really get technical, blended finance is often trying to solve a very specific market barrier at one specific point in that chain, right? So you might be trying to, get energy efficiency loans, right, to kind of take root and get banks to issue those loans. And so then you have to really understand the micro aspects of that market, right? Why aren't those loans being made? And if you kind of tweak the model a little bit, maybe there's a guarantee, maybe there's a longer tenor for repayment, maybe there's some, discounted source of capital, something like that, that would be sufficient to catalyze the market and remove the barriers. That's what blended finance is about.
Yeah, but how do you choose which technology or product or service to subsidize? It sounds just as risky as just investing in it if it hasn't proven commercial viability. How do you pick? Are you picking based on a net good to the world, or is it something else?
Well, so that there's let me distinguish between the sort of the strategy and the toolkit, right? So there's the sort of the nuts and bolts of how you do it. It's another set of challenging questions, why and where you do it, right? And you ask a very valid question, right? Why would you pick a specific technology to be subsidized over another? And that's a very challenging question. In the case of clean energy, you don't necessarily have to pick one particular technology, but it's pretty clear which ones are low carbon and which ones aren't, right? So you could say, I will offer this subsidy to any technology as long as it doesn't result in carbon emissions, right? And it just so happened that solar and wind were the first out of the chute because they're the most technologically advanced and commercially developed, right?
They also have to be viable to be worth investment or worth subsidy,
They have to be viable. That is a classic technology chicken and egg problem. Most technologies are not completely developed from scratch by innovators in the private sector. There are exceptions, but most of them build on the innovation of inventors, scientists, government agencies that did the spade work to actually invent the technology, like the physics, the chemistry, and the biology of whatever it is that's happening, right? And all props to the entrepreneurs who commercialize it, right? But it's not true that those commercial products start from zero. in the vast majority of cases. Someone had to invest in those technologies. And when those technologies were created, they were not a sure bet. So pretty much you can take any technology in existence and say, well, why did you invest in that? Because it wasn't a sure bet. And the answer is because we need new technologies and someone had to do it, right? And someone took the risk, someone believed, and you take, you take a scattershot approach. I mean, venture capital, invests in like 10 companies and only expects one to succeed, right? They may get 100x return on that one unicorn, right? But 9 out of 10 investments may go bust, right? And that's kind of how innovation works at the early stage. And someone has to be there to take that risk. And it's frequently the government, or in some cases, it can be investors who are able to profitably have a kind of portfolio distribution like that, right? But that's why blended finance exists. Is it's one of many tools that the public uses to make sure that there's enough investment in solutions that are not yet commercially viable. Some things never become commercially viable, and that's why there are government services, right? And why there's philanthropy. But for things that can ultimately become commercially viable, you have to bridge the valley of death to a technology that's unproven. No one would invest in it. They wouldn't put their own money in it because it's too risky, but it has potential. And if we're going to solve social or environmental problem X, we need technologies capable of solving problem X, right? And someone has to make those early investments. So you have all the early investments in R&D and stuff like that. And then when you're at like the 2-yard line, right, and you're trying to put the ball in the end zone, you're not quite commercial yet, and you need your lighter fluid, right, to get the market going. And that's like what blended finance does. Is it does those first like commercial projects that have a sweetener in them, something that's a little bit better than market terms, but it then provides proof positive to the market that this thing works and that you will not only get your money back, you'll make a profit. And then the idea is after you've proven it, the market then takes care of itself, and then blended finance professionals go on to the next problem.
Yeah. So what are you guys working on right now?
What are we working on now? So I can tell you about a big program that I'm working on, which Definitely. I've spent most of 2021 on, which is called the EU-US Climate Risk and Resilience Cooperation. It's kind of a mouthful, but basically it's a transatlantic partnership, back to partnerships, funded by the European Union and the US Climate Alliance, which is an alliance of 25 state governors' offices that are particularly committed to climate action and have banded together to kind of collaborate and share expertise. And that's exactly what this partnership is, although it expands beyond just US states to also work with entities in Europe. And it's focused specifically on investment in climate resilience, particularly climate resilient infrastructure, and managing climate risk through approaches that are led by the government, but often with collaboration from the private sector and from investors. That's it in a nutshell. It is itself a grant program that is generously funded by both of those partners, the EU. But it is about exchanging expertise amongst policy practitioners as well as investors and other experts to drive action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement, particularly on adaptation and resilience. So the Paris Agreement basically has 3 pillars: mitigation, emissions reduction; adaptation, which is making us sort of robust in the face of a changing climate; and finance. People, you hear a lot about the 100 billion, about the finance. You hear a lot about emissions reductions. You don't hear as much, I don't think, about adaptation. But we do see headlines every day about climate-fueled natural disasters, wildfires, storms, hurricanes, sea level rise, floods from like flash flooding from crazy precipitation events. You know, the list is very long and it's growing. These are climate impacts that are already happening today, and they're only going to get more severe. And this is a problem that's been pretty much neglected, even though scientists have been sounding the alarm for decades. Most people have only begun to notice these impacts recently, and we are way behind the curve to adapt ourselves to the climate of today, let alone the climate of tomorrow. And so we have a gargantuan amount of investment to make our societies, our infrastructure, our built environment, even our natural environments resilient in the face of a changing climate.
Right.
So that's what this is about. Now we're starting to get our arms around the problem, but we still need to invest in the solution. That's where the climate finance advisor's role comes in, right? It's how do we figure out what we need to invest in, create the enabling environment for that investment to happen, and then actually get the dollars to flow. And so this partnership is exploring those various challenges, mostly through the eyes of, say, a state government official who's guiding their climate policy on resilience and trying to figure out how the heck do I protect my constituents and get these investments made in climate resilience as quickly and effectively as possible. And so some of that is about planning. Some of it is about, legislation and government programs. And a lot of it is about figuring out, how do you work with different elements in the private sector to actually get capital to flow and get these investments made and infrastructure built so that societies are protected before the next storm or the next wildfire.
Yeah. So speaking of elements in the private sector and mitigating risk, just at the end here, I wanted to ask you, like, what role like these insurance companies can play to creating like climate smart investments, and are their models going to continue to be viable when everything starts getting hit by disaster consistently? They're in the whole point of the insurance companies, they make money because disasters don't happen, don't they?
That's true. Although I'm not so worried about the insurance companies. I'm worried about the insurers, right? Those who buy the policies, because the insurers, almost all insurance policies are one-year policies. So insurers could have a really bad year, and in theory, an insurer could be wiped out where one terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year completely, erases them from the face of the earth. But what is likely to happen in most cases is those losses rise and insurers readjust every year. And what can they do if the disasters keep rising and expanding? They raise premiums or they leave the market. And ultimately, those two things are basically the same, because if you keep raising premiums, ultimately people will stop buying the insurance because it's not affordable. And then the market kind of falls apart by itself. And that is already happening in a lot of places, right? Flood insurance in coastal Florida, wildfire insurance in California. These are insurance markets that have a lot of problems. And they're tough problems to solve because someone has to pay either for the damages or for the investments to prevent the damages from happening in the first place. And it's a society-wide problem. Insurance in many respects kind of sits in the middle of it. And insurers need to be a big part of the solution, and reinsurers, I might add, but they also can't do it by themselves, right? You have to really kind of think about it from a systems perspective. How do we, as you were saying, change incentives, but how do we also change the way we build our cities, right?
Yeah,
And our
well, do those
infrastructure.
companies invest in resilience at all? You imagine they would.
Well, so insurers do two things basically, right? They underwrite insurance policies, meaning they take on risk, right, from the parties they insure, and they invest. They invest the proceeds of those premiums, right, and hold on to them and grow those investments for the rainy day when they have to pay them out,
Yeah,
right?
but
So
invest in what?
well, my point is simply that insurers are some of the largest institutional asset owners and asset managers in the world. So they
Sounds
sit on a
powerful.
huge pot of money. And so when you talk about how can insurers be part of the solution, you're really talking about two things, right? You're talking about how do they interact in the insurance markets with the entities they're insuring, and what are the incentives there? What are they willing to insure, under what circumstances, and so forth. That's sort of one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is getting them to invest those trillions of dollars that they're sitting on in climate solutions, just like any other investor would, right? And insurers, you would think, are particularly motivated to do that, in theory, because they want to make their pool of insureds more resilient, right? And so they have a sort of a double incentive to invest in these solutions. The other thing about these institutional asset owners, like insurers, it's also true for pensions and endowments and state owned wealth funds. They play the long game, right? They need to be around to meet their obligations decades in the future. And so in theory, their incentives are very well aligned for a problem that is bad today, but is really going to be bad decades from now. And so we need to be thinking long term. And so there's a lot of potential for the insurance sector to be a very powerful force for good on these climate issues. But there are a lot of challenges there too.
Andrew, thank you for trying to explain the most complicated systematic interactions of our economy in less than an hour. I'm glad we got someone like you thinking about this kind of stuff. It's been great to have you. Last question I always love to ask people is any advice you have for young people who are passionate about creating a positive impact here in this lovely world we live in.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And I feel like I've been kind of talking a mile a minute on a lot of topics. So I hope
Good.
some of it made sense. You'll have to tell me when
They
you
can
talk
slow
to
it
your
down.
listeners. Okay. Well, slowing it down just means they'll hear it, right? It still doesn't really make sense. But so to answer your question, what can they do? Well, I think first and foremost, living in a democracy, we need to vote for elected officials who take this problem seriously. And so I would say first and foremost is, vote, get up to speed on, the political debates around climate and sustainability where you live, whether it's your school board, whether it's voting for president and, everything in between. It's really important. And There are reasons to be cynical about a lot of things, but um, you don't really have a right to complain if you're not voting and participating in the process. That's what I think. So you got to do that first, right? And you can do even more to be active, in political campaigns and helping to develop good legislation, pressuring groups that have influence to take good positions or to come up with good rules or to vote for good rules and stuff like that. I think that's the single most important thing. But you can also invest your money now in clean solutions, and you don't have to have a lot. There are a lot of emerging platforms now that allow you to invest in sustainability, and you don't just have to invest in that sort of market ETF anymore. That also has oil companies and coal companies and whatever in there that you might not want to invest in anymore. It is much easier now to invest your values than it was just a couple years ago. Even it's a very rapidly changing space, and so I would say do that too.
I couldn't agree more. Andrew, thanks for coming on the show, man. I really truly appreciate what you're doing, man.
Thanks so much, Ethan. Me too. Respect. Thank you so much
Respect.
for having me. This has been great, and happy to join you anytime.
My pleasure. All right, everybody. See you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Changing the Climate. Here at Climate Change Realty, we don't just donate 50% of our net commissions to fight climate change, we also donate a full 50% of our real estate referrals. So if you or anyone else you know is looking to buy or sell a home anywhere in the USA and would like to create thousands of dollars in donations without any cost out of pocket, please visit ccrboulder.com today.